Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to the 6th webinar of Nature-Based Solutions Digital Dialogues 2020. This final webinar is on governing nature-based solutions, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the moderator for this session, Dr. Thomas Hale. Tom's research explores how we can manage transnational problems effectively and fairly. He seeks to explain how political institutions evolve, or not, to face the challenges raised by globalization and interdependence, with a particular emphasis on environmental and economic issues. He holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University, a master's degree in global politics from the London School of Economics, and an AB in public policy from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. A US national, Thomas has studied and worked in Argentina, China, and Europe. His books include Beyond Gridlock, Between Interests and Law, The Politics of Transnational Commercial Disputes, Transnational Climate Change Governance, and Gridlock, Why Global Cooperation is Failing and Why We Need It Most. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So our final panel in this exciting conference looks at governance, and 2020 was planned to be a key moment in the global governance of nature-based solutions and indeed of the entire transition to sustainability. It was the year that it was going to see both COP15 take place, the Convention on Biological Diversity process in Kunming in China this fall, and of course the year in which COP26 was going to take place here in the UK in November. In other words, it was what many people described as a super year for nature-based solutions, with sustainability solutions focused on nature being really at the heart of the nexus of those two critical international conferences. We all know that those events are now postponed, but I don't think we really realized just how super a year 2020 would be. The events are postponed, but the issues are, of course, more important than ever. And indeed, I'd say we're really at a critical juncture where the choices we make now on these questions will really shape the choices that are available to us in the future. We could put ourselves onto a very negative pathway, I think, where solutions become less and less available over time, or actually onto a more productive pathway. That's our hope, at least. And we see a huge need now to get this question in this super year even more front and center than it would have been previously. I think it's a critical juncture really for two reasons. First, the efforts at economic recovery can either lock in on sustainable aspects of the economy, or they can accelerate exactly the transition we need toward greater sustainability. Whatever the outcome, the choice is going to be very consequential. And secondly, it's a wake-up call, I think, this crisis, for the resilience and the strength of our national, our local, and our global governance systems generally. These systems, I think, have been exposed to be weaker than we would like them to be in too many cases. And that could lead, again, to different outcomes. It could lead to a further deterioration of these vital social systems that keep us safe. Or it could, if we make the right choices, help us accelerate toward a better system, make us realize that actually we need to be building up something stronger to make us safer and more resilient and more prosperous in the future. So within that context, the panel today, even though it's taking place online, is actually addressing a question that's even more important maybe than when we originally planned to bring you all together to discuss these questions, because we need these solutions. We need to find ways that governance can really deliver them. Where do we find them? Well, these international processes are, of course, ultimately based on action and implementation at the national or even the local level. So this panel is going to explore innovations, the national governance of nature-based solutions, and ask how international processes can draw on, support, catalyze, diffuse, and otherwise expand and build on successful examples, how they can be part of this broader moment, this critical juncture that we're in. I'm going to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras so we can join us on the virtual stage, if you will. We have a fantastic set of speakers to discuss these topics today. Let me briefly introduce them, and then we'll jump into the session. I'm going to introduce them in the order they're here on my list. First is Rosa Morales, who is a senior researcher at the Institute of Peruvian Studies. Before serving at the Research Institute, Ms. Morales was the General Director of the General Direction of Climate Change and Desertification in the Ministry of Environment in Peru. And in that role, she led on NDC implementation and development and looked across especially how the NDC interacted with 5 thematic areas, including water, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and aquaculture, and health. And so these questions of how we leverage nature-based solutions to help us with this critical moment in both nature, but also climate and even health is very much in her wheelhouse. We're also joined by Professor Colin Meyer, who is the Peter Moore's Professor of Management Studies at the Said Business School here in Oxford, and before that, a Dean of the Business School. Colin is an expert on all aspects of corporate finance, of governance and taxation, regulation of financial institutions, and the role of the corporation in contemporary society. Actually, I would add that Colin's one of the people leading the rethinking of the role of corporations in society at the moment. And he's going to talk to us about his interest in natural capital and how we make that part of the solution. We're also joined by Dr. Salim El-Houk. So, Salim is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development since 2009. He's also a senior fellow at the International Institute for Environment and Development here in London. And Salim is a long-standing expert and a leading thinker and a participant in the UNFCCC negotiations, and obviously and that role has been a key voice for the least developed countries thinking about vulnerability and adaptation. And it's also an important author on these subjects, contributing, for example, to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports on these topics. So welcome, Salim. And last but by no means least is Ms. Claire Johnstone, who is a Green Finance Manager at the UK Environment Agency. And there she leads a team developing and implementing new funding models for nature restoration here in the UK. And the idea is to help stimulate the nature-based, what she calls a nature-positive sector. So we'll hear about the efforts here in the UK as well from Claire. Our format today is going to be fairly conversational, and we'll try to get a lot of interaction. You in the audience, please ask questions through the Q&A function. We'll try to bring in as many of those as we can to learn more about how we can make nature-based solutions, drawn governance solutions to scale them up, get them to where we need to get them. Let me go first to you, Claire, to ask about what kinds of domestic governance arrangements we see around nature-based solutions here in the UK. What can we learn for these kinds of the work that you're doing?
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. Tom, I hope you can hear me okay. It's great to be here with you today, and thanks very much for the opportunity to talk with you all. I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the key governance developments emerging post-Brexit in England, which I think will be interesting to hear about. Before I do, it's worth mentioning as a bit of context that the overarching governance framework for nature-based solutions in England is the 25-year environment plan, which was published in 2018, and Colin's going to talk a bit more about that shortly. And although the 25-year environment plan doesn't talk about nature-based solutions specifically, it does embed the concept of natural capital as the overarching theme, which is a related concept, as you know. It's a high-level framework setting out 10 goals and targets around clean air, water, resource use, healthy plants and animals, etc. And the forthcoming bills that we have that I'm going to talk about, the Environment Bill and the Agriculture Bill, are going to be seeking to establish those targets and goals as legislative requirements and put some timescales around those. It's worth saying as well, just very quickly, that underneath that overarching framework, we have a bit of a fragmented policy landscape, and that's why these developments that I'm going to quickly mention are really quite exciting, because they're hopefully going to provide a way of bringing these things together a bit better. So the first thing I want to mention is in the forthcoming Environment Bill, which is a piece of legislation called Biodiversity Net Gain, which is a new law which is designed to result in where development results in damage to biodiversity and habitats, to offset that damage, to require the impactor to offset that by recreating a net increase in that type of habitat in the local area. And if they're not able to do that in the local area, then to purchase credits for it to create elsewhere. It's initially focusing on biodiversity, but it's hopefully going to be laying the foundation for a much wider set of investment and markets in nature restoration. So that's a really exciting development that's coming through. We've also seen in the Environment Bill local nature recovery strategies, which is going to provide a set of spatial evidence, data and priorities around nature restoration in the each area around the UK, and pilots are being progressed at the moment on those. The other thing to really worth mentioning at the moment is the agricultural bill post-Brexit. This is a really significant policy development in that it's about shifting subsidies for activities that are previously damaging nature to those that are now going to be to subsidies to benefit nature under the new Environmental Land Management Scheme, or ELMS. And really, we're hopefully going to see under that very large sums of public money being spent on nature restoration and nature-friendly farming. So we got some really exciting governance and policy developments coming up in the next kind of year or two. And I think what we need to do is really think about ways to kind of draw those together to make a coherent response for nature across our landscapes. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Claire. Fascinating 3 examples of innovative things that we might want to build on. Quick clarifying question from the audience. Do these apply in England only, or are they UK-wide?
I think they are England only for the moment, but I will just, I'll just check that. I think, yes, I think they are.
Great, so 3 interesting ideas, which I'm sure we'll pick up more on from England, possibly the UK as a whole, and the nature-based solutions front. Rosa, can we turn to you next and ask, what does this look like in Peru? What governance innovations are you working on in Peru that you think might be good candidates for scaling up, replicating, drawing on in other countries?
Thank you, Tom. I'm very happy to be here, and I'll try to share with you my ideas. The first thing that I thought when the question was posted, in terms of what does domestic governance would look like in our country, the first thing I thought was that when thinking on governance, we have to think of interaction and decision-making among the actors involved in a collective problem. So this is why I thought it would be nice to look at some already experienced experiences in Peru, such as the one on climate change. We all know that NbS has a lot to bring to the ambition and to the upscaling of NDCs. So this is why I choose this approach. In Peru, we have built the governance around NDCs, and I would like to focus this on 2 main processes. One in terms of action, of climate action, and the other one in terms of legal framework. In terms of the action, one of the main focuses was the participation of all the sectors, all the appropriate sectors, the multi-stakeholders, and with a multi-level approach. We managed to bring 13 sectors that can bring NDCs or actions and on adaptation and mitigation. And the very important thing of this was the appropriation they had. They managed to include actions on climate change, but with their own priorities being taken in consideration. And this is very, very important in terms of governance, because this is something that the environment sector is not going to be able to do, things on energy, agriculture, land use change, etc. In terms of the multi-level work, we all know, and you started saying that it is very important, the implementation in the ground, and not only at the national level, but also at the local level. So we think that NbS brings a lot of opportunities in order to implement things in the field. And ultimately, it is the local rules, the social norms, and the value systems and culture that can uphold a sustainable governance framework for NbS. In terms of the multi-stakeholder approach, we developed at some point, and it is still going on, a model to bring space for dialogue and the involvement of collective construction. And we had this space called Dialoguemos for the NDCs, for the legal framework, and also for forests and climate change regarding safeguards and governance, etc. Of course, I'm not saying that everything is perfect and it's done, but I think it's an ongoing process. And something very important also that I would like to highlight as a challenge still is that, as we all know, adaptation and mitigation can be worked synergically. And this is something that where nature-based solutions can provide an opportunity to work on this. And so we need to identify key interventions with high potential to deliver climate change mitigation and adaptation benefits at the same time as addressing societal challenges. On the legal framework, we have an act or law on climate change, and we also had its bylaw, and it Peru tried to build this in a participatory way, as I already said. One very important issue here is the prior consultation made for the bylaw, which allowed the indigenous peoples and communities in the Andean regions also and the tropical forests to participate on the building of the bylaw mainly. So what I'm trying to say is that given all this framework for climate change, we can have some lessons learned to build on the nature-based solutions. And I will come to this a little bit more maybe in the next question. Thank you.
Great. Well, it sounds like definitely a lesson learned. And one of the lessons that shines out very clearly is the need to have a framework that actually allows us to have conversations across different sorts of groups and create inclusion around development of solutions. Not an easy task, a time-consuming one, but probably a necessary one, as you're saying, to get lasting solutions. So I wonder if I might come to you next and look at what the status of what kinds of innovations we're seeing around the governance of NbS in Bangladesh. Are you using tools like Claire mentioned, or drawing on methodologies, engagement practices like Rosa, or are there some new ideas that are also bubbling up in the mix?
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for inviting me to join this excellent panel. So I would say in Bangladesh, we are still new in the nature-based solutions realm, but nevertheless, we have had some very interesting and I would say innovative actions done. And I'll start with the very high level one that the Bangladesh Parliament, under the leadership of the Standing Committee on Environment, Mr. Sabir Hossain Chaudhry, Member of Parliament, took some months ago to declare a planetary emergency. This is a high level resolution of the Parliament, unanimously adopted by all parties, calling for a planetary emergency, which, unlike many of the other parliaments around the world who have done climate emergencies, is not just a climate emergency. It's climate and biodiversity at the same time. So there was a recognition of a double emergency rather than a single emergency. And since then, under their direction, the government has been instructed to figure out how to deal with this emergency that has been declared and recognized. Now, in the government level, we have a very strong tradition of national planning. We have a very strong planning ministry. They prepare 5-year plans. We are now in our 7th 5-year plan. They are now preparing the 8th 5-year plan. And so we are looking at how nature-based solutions can be incorporated into the national plan. There's also a much longer term plan called the Delta Plan that takes the country to 2100. And that is definitely one in which they are very keen to include nature-based solutions. The challenge we have is finding practical ways of demonstrating what it means and incorporating them. And to that end, what we have done is we have created a network of academics, researchers, NGOs, local communities, people who have a history of engaging in different aspects of ecosystem management, nature-based solution, of which we have a long history. We have a lot of wetlands in Bangladesh, a lot of wetland management experience, a lot of forest areas like the biggest mangrove forest in the world, the Sundarbans, with a lot of community-based forest management skills and knowledge. So what we're trying to do is to bring all of that together. And last 5th of June, World Environment Day, we launched a national nature-based solution network, bringing together, I think we have now over 100 participants from a variety of different sectors, including government people. So for the government, it's really taking them up a learning curve. There's not a huge, except for the people working in directly in forestry or in fisheries, who do have a sort of biological background. The rest of the government system is traditionally not up to speed on what we are talking about when we talk about nature-based solution. But the good news is they're willing to listen and they're willing to learn. And so we are now, I would say, in a learning phase where we are trying to take people, and the question they always ask is, tell us practically what we have to do. And that really is a challenge to us as researchers to come up with practical solutions that we can offer them to take forward. So one of the ways in which we plan to do this going forward, and I'll end with this now and I'll come back later if there are questions, is next January, every January, we hold a major conference that brings together the research community on climate change in Bangladesh, more than 50 universities and research institutes. We've been doing this for a number of years. Next January, from the 21st to the 24th, will be the 7th year running. We plan to have a major session on nature-based solutions where we hope to bring together all this experience, bring the senior government officials. The conference is very much research into action. We bring in senior decision makers, and then for the research community, we present things we think that they need to be aware of in a manner that they can then take up into their decision making. So January is like a target date for us to come up with some practical ideas that we can then pitch to them, advise them, and hopefully have them take up into their national planning going forward. And let me just end by saying that there's going to be a global adaptation summit, which was originally going to be held in the Netherlands in October. That has now been postponed to the 25th of January and is no longer going to be a single event in a single country, but it's planned to be a rolling 24-hour event starting in the Pacific and then going in 2-3 hour segments in different anchor events, they're called, over the course of 24 hours. One of those anchor events will be in Bangladesh on the 25th of January, most likely to be opened and a keynote given by our Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, who will speak on adaptation in generally. And we're hoping that we can put nature-based solutions into her major keynote speech, which will be a global keynote speech as well. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to do to embed nature-based solutions into actual practice on the ground in national planning and sectoral planning in Bangladesh. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Salim. I think it's fascinating to see how you've got both the top level buy-in with the parliamentary declaration, also the bottom up sort of community level knowledge about how to manage wetland areas, for example. And now it's the middle that needs to get filled in with these practical solutions. So hopefully we'll end the panel today with a few more ideas to add to that list. And also wonderful to see the adaptation conference is walking the walk by actually adapting to the new circumstances in an innovative way. So that's good, a good lesson for us all. Colin, can we come to you next? You're looking, of course, across countries and really at the role of business in a new sort of role for business in society. But you've been involved very much in this idea of natural capital. How can that be a basis for governments to implement practical solutions like the kinds of things asking for with nature-based solutions? Oh, Colin, I think you're on mute. Apologies. Always a difficulty of trying to do too many Skype things at the same moment. I think, Colin, we still seem to be on mute. At the bottom. There we are.
Sorry about that. Okay, so thank you very much indeed, Tom. What I'd like to do is just talk about the framework that is being used in the UK around natural capital for promoting nature-based solutions. In 2011, the UK government brought out a white paper that stated that this generation in the UK should be the first to leave the natural environment in a better state that it inherited it. There were 5 components to the governance of nature-based solutions that was associated with that. The first was the establishment of a Natural Capital Committee. And I'm a member of that UK Natural Capital Committee and have observed how, in practice, as the first, I think, Natural Capital Committee in the world, it's attempted to really establish a governance mechanism for promoting nature-based solutions. As Claire mentioned, underpinning this is a 25-year plan, and the importance of the 25-year plan was in terms of it spanning a number of periods of governments, so that in essence it would provide a degree of commitment to successive governments in terms of the implementation of natural capital solutions. It's been legislated in the form of an Environment Act, and there's an Office of Environmental Protection that's been set up to oversee its implementation. But what I'd really like to emphasize is the importance of measurement in relation to the adoption of natural capital in general, but in particular in relation to nature-based solutions. The traditional way in which we value natural capital is in terms of the services that are derived from it. And there's an international standard that's used in this area that measures the values of ecosystem services, the system of environmental economic accounting. In 2012, the Rio Summit established a commitment by a number of countries to produce natural capital accounts by 2020, and the Office of National Statistics, the ONS in the UK, this year will produce the first set of natural capital accounts that basically follow that SEER approach of valuing of the ecosystem services. Now, what I want to emphasize is the relationship between that type of approach of measuring natural assets and what one observes in terms of the nature of the state of natural assets themselves, and whether or not it's really reflected in the provision of nature-based solutions. So what emerged is that the value of the UK natural assets are currently established as being somewhat below £1 trillion. Now that compares, for example, with a housing stock in the UK of £7 trillion and a GDP of £2.6 trillion. So the whole of the UK's natural assets are valued as being approximately a third or so of 1 year's worth of GDP and a seventh of the housing stock. And nearly half of that is associated with recreational services. A lot is agricultural biomass, fossil fuels, carbon sequestration, and water abstraction. So the issue I want to raise is that if one uses this approach of measurement, First of all, it seems to come out with a valuation of our natural assets, which is extremely low, and in some respects, implausibly low. But furthermore, what one observes at the same time as we've been documenting a rise in the value of natural assets, that there's a continuing decline in the quality of our natural assets, with evidence in terms of, for example, of air pollutants, in general not improving, in some cases deteriorating, and only in a few cases actually improving. In terms of quality of water and surface water problems, a continuous deterioration in those. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, only a decline where there's been a shift towards more renewable sources of production and virtually no change in terms of the main users, the domestic, industrial users, and in transport. So one thing I want to turn back to later on is this question of how can we, in terms of trying to govern for nature-based solutions, think about ways of measuring that are more aligned with the actual delivery of nature-based solutions and the preservation of the underlying quality and extent of nature.
Thank you, Colin. I think it highlights a really interesting challenge, or one of the methodologies for governance, of course, is measurement. You can't manage what you don't measure, you can't govern what you don't measure, but actually the choice of measurement could be quite consequential and maybe, as you're suggesting, not accurate in this case. So an important project to work on there. I'd like to switch gears if we can and drill down a bit deeper into the solution space though, because our hope today is to leave the panel with a few concrete ideas about what we can build up in our quiver, our toolbox of solutions going forward. You mentioned a few ideas already, but I think one of the questions I saw in the chat was, how do we actually address properly the urgency of this moment, this critical juncture we're in? We need solutions might take time to develop, but we actually need to get going quite soon because there's no time to wait. So what kind of innovations are you seeing in the places you're working that you might recommend for others to pick up and take forward? We can go back to you first, Claire, to give us some more thoughts on those three different ideas you thought. What can we do? What innovations can we build on there?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I'm going to give a really specific example, actually, of something in the water policy area, which could be replicated, actually. It shows how, actually, interestingly, having the right policy environment can create a kind of interesting opportunity around collaborative governance and co-funding, blending funding for solutions. So in this example, we have a water company in the northwest of England called United Utilities. They introduced a charge for their business and non-domestic customers based on the amount of hard surface they have on their property. So how much of the surface water rainfall, when it hits the ground, actually ends up running into the sewage and wastewater network, based on, because obviously if it's a concrete, then it will just run in and overwhelm the sewage system. And then we get serious pollution incidents, as you know. So the charge works by the more hard surface you have on your property, the higher the charge. And which actually acts as an incentive for organizations, domestic and business organizations, to install SUDs and green infrastructure, so sustainable urban drainage systems on their properties. And by doing so, they can reduce their charge, and over time, it can create a kind of revenue stream. So there's a project that has kind of developed on the back of this in Greater Manchester, which is looking at how this kind of approach could be scaled up across the region. And in fact, it could be also scaled up nationally if that charging structure was adopted by all water companies and supported by the economic regulator that we have. So that's a really interesting, kind of very specific example of how kind of creating a policy, a charging kind of structure and a regulation that can kind of drive that innovation. If I've got time, I wanted to mention really quickly another one, which was around some seed cord funding that we had recently to develop nature-based projects that can attract private investment. So we are looking at things like ecotourism and farmer-led nutrient trading and community funding for natural flood management and things like that. So that's kind of the government providing a bit of seed corn funding that can help NGOs and community organizations to develop nature-based solutions.
I love the idea of reducing your water bill if you get a bit more grass in around your property and less concrete. That seems like a very smart, very replicable thing.
Yes.
I wish my outside, you can't see out my window, but there's a lot of concrete out there, and it would be great if we could have that here.
Yeah.
Rosa, are you seeing any of those kinds of examples of sort of really nice innovations that we could scale up in the work you've done? And I wonder also, if there's some experiences from your work on the NDC with climate change that actually can translate into the NbS space, because obviously these are really the same agenda, even though they get different acronyms in the UN processes.
Yes, thank you. I would like to share with you some accomplishments that I see as innovations. First of all, in terms of national instruments, we have managed to bring the NDCs into our national infrastructure plan, mainly through resilient infrastructure. From my point of view, we could have reached more, but at the moment what we have in the National Infrastructure Plan is to take into account a sustainability aspect, which is reached or taken into account by an index or a variable. On the other hand, we have the National Competitivity Plan. These two instruments come from the Ministry of Economy and Finance, which is very important because as we all know, these decision makers of this sector are very important in all our economies. And in this National Competitivity Plan, what we have is that one of the achievements that it should have is a financial strategy for the NDCs. So these are two ways in which we are including or making decision making in a cross-cutting way in terms of environment issues such as climate change. And the main point here is that it is our view that NbS needs to be inserted at this moment in major economic decisions and processes to scale them up, and mainly in the post-COVID recuperation phase. This is a very important moment for humankind, I think, because we are understanding how science can inform us, how nature can help us to direct our lives and our economies. And so we have to take advantage of this very special moment, let's call it that way. On the other hand, in terms more specifically on climate innovations, we had some mandates coming from the climate change law. I would say that the first one was the Indigenous Peoples Climate Platform that comes also from a mandate of the Paris Agreement, as you know. And here it is very important to acknowledge the traditional knowledge that communities and indigenous peoples bring to the table. And here in Peru, I think that we have kind of a rich biocultural diversity. And this can help us also to manage nature and to enhance human well-being. The second innovation or achievement would be that this week it has been regulated, the high-level Commission on Climate Change at the level of ministers. This is a very a unique space for high-level decision makers in Peru. And this is also a space where we can manage to bring nature-based solutions, discussions, and actions. And the third one, which is also very related to the nature or the features that we hope that nature-based solutions can have, which is to inform, is the monitoring system for adaptation and mitigation measures that was also created in the law, which is the enhanced transparency framework mandated by the Paris Agreement that we have in Peru. So the aspect of measurement is very important. I was very interested in what Colin Meyer said on how is it that the UK is measuring the value of natural capital. I think that in order for us, a developing country, to reach this, we are in the moment where we are developing the ways in which we can measure systematically the results of environmental interventions, say nature-based solutions, for example. And these kinds of innovation, institutional innovations, can help us also on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. I hope that is indeed true, that we can cross-pollinate some of these solutions to help everyone do this more effectively. Celine, let me turn to you next. So you mentioned you were seeking more concrete solutions, but I'm guessing you already know one or two already that you're seeing in practice there. So I wonder what you might emphasize for us today.
Sure, thank you, Tom. So let me also pick up on one of the questions from the Q&A, which is about the need to scale up and be fast. So one of the reflections I have with regards to what I would call traditional conservation movements, of which we have quite a few in Bangladesh, is we haven't been fast enough. You know, we have lots of little things, little victories here and there, and they're very useful, but they aren't adding up and they're not going fast enough. And so what I see the opportunity with this paradigm shift to nature-based solutions is to go for scale and to go for large, buy-in by the most senior authorities making decisions about the national development plans. And as I said, in Bangladesh, national development plans are taken extremely seriously. We set up a 5-year plan with a very powerful planning ministry. And once the plan is in place, then even a change in government really can't change it. A new government coming in, a political government, has to wait till the next plan for them to put into place their political commitments. So it's hardwired in and more or less set in stone. And so, as I said, we have the 8th 5-year plan under preparation right now. And so we want to get in there. We want to get the nature-based solutions in. And we can't do everything. So we've chosen one or two opportunities that we feel are the most promising, and I'll share one of them with you, which is, as I said earlier, protecting the largest mangrove forest in the world, 2/3 of which is in Bangladesh, called the Sundarbans. Now, Bangladesh has already invested a significant amount of money in building a bridge on the river Ganges, which is almost complete. It'll start running fairly soon. And once it's completed, it will link the Sundarban area and the southwestern part of the country with Dhaka, which is in the middle of the country, and it will lead to economic development, which is a good thing. But it will also lead to the wrong kind of economic development, which will end up destroying potentially the Sundarban forest if it's done wrong. And so what we're trying to do is to put in place regulations and opportunities to do it right, to have a peripheral industrial as well as tourism and other kinds of environment-friendly economic opportunities created around the Sundarbans, which will not lead to its destruction and lead to its preservation and conservation, but at the same time also offering employment, jobs, profitability for companies and private sector. So we want the right kind of private sector development, not the wrong kind of private sector development there. And unfortunately, the wrong kind is already beginning to happen. And so now is the time to step in and move the path towards a greener investment plan on nature-based solutions. And that's what we're trying to do. And as I said, the good news is that the decision makers are willing to listen, but they want something practical for them to do. And that's really the challenge to us. The ball's in our court to come up with something that we can advise them to do. But we are hopeful we'll be able to do that.
Thank you. One of the interesting themes that I think everyone's spoken to thus far has been the importance of planning and plans. And we've had plans arranged for 25 years in Colin's case to 5-year plan. You're talking about the 100-year plan, the 2100-year plan. So it seems like this is a key kind of way to think about how we orient direction of travel, even as we really quickly try to create very practical steps on the ground to deliver on it, joining at the long term with the immediate. Colin, can I turn to you next? What innovative solutions do you see that we could pick up, tomorrow or today that would help us make some really practical progress on this question?
Well, thank you. And I'd like to return to this issue about how we could do better in terms of measurement, because as a lot of the speakers have said, what is key in this area is to get the right partnerships going and to have the necessary levels of investment. And one of the issues that arises in terms of the way in which we measure things at the moment is it's not really establishing where we need to place resources and how we should evaluate the scale of the resources that are required. And that's because of the fact that we are, as I was describing, valuing things simply in terms of services that are derived. And as one of the questioners asked, can one really do that sort of valuation in any accurate fashion? And the answer is it's incredibly difficult. And one of the issues that arises in this regard that's particularly relevant to nature-based solutions is that we're not really valuing nature in its own right. We're not as such accounting for the deterioration in the condition of natural assets, not incorporating the costs of maintaining and restoring natural assets to their appropriate condition. So there are some, I think, really quite innovative approaches that are being taken in the UK to address this. For one thing, what I think we've correctly recognized is that one has to have a baseline. One has to have a baseline, essentially census of the national assets, to do the equivalent of a census of a population, but to do it in terms of national assets to determine what you've got and what the condition of those assets are. And then to monitor the change in the condition of those assets and the stock of them over time. And then to establish, well, what is the cost of maintaining those natural assets? And in the case of natural assets that we're not overutilizing, where they can basically renew themselves, then we're talking about assets that for which the cost of maintenance is very low, if not zero, and they're essentially infinitely lived assets. But on the other hand, for those assets that are approaching some sort of critical threshold level, then the investment is substantial and is critical to ensuring their preservation. So what I think this is pointing to is much more of a focus in terms of the governance of assets, in terms of how one identifies where the critical investments need to be made, how one should measure the extent and the costs of restoring natural assets based on their condition. And then, of course, we're interested in allocation in terms of the ecosystem services that we derive, in terms of the factors, for example, I've just mentioned, in terms of air quality, carbon sequestration, water quality, etc. But in essence, one has to start off with the right base for being able to undertake those measurements, to then create the framework in which one can determine the necessary investments. And on top of that, one then needs to have the coordinated governance by private and public sector bodies, landowners, NGOs, local communities, etc., around what emerges from those appropriate measurements and investments.
Really interesting points. I think, we often sometimes think of measurement as some sort of technocratic function that's sort of left to some nerds to figure out. But actually, as we're describing for this issue in particular, how you measure is a key governance choice, indeed a political choice, and therefore needs to be thought about quite carefully. If we get it right, could be an important driver for governance solutions. One of the questions in the chat is asking, how can the heterogeneity of different contexts be taken into account for this kind of thing? I wonder if we might ask the panel to reflect on that a bit. If we think narrowly about climate mitigation, a ton in Peru is the same as a ton in Bangladesh, is the same as a ton in the UK. If we think about an ecosystem in the UK, in Peru, Bangladesh, or elsewhere, it'll have quite different ecology, quite different social context around it, quite different sets of values, cultural values, economic values, et cetera, to people who interact with it. So given that the higher level of complexity here, how do we think about measuring or comparing kind of nature-based solutions in that context? Anyone want to come in on that, Colin?
Yeah, and that really illustrates the point extremely well, that you basically need two parallel systems of measurement. Yes, the valuation that may be attached to them in Peru might be different from that in Bangladesh, from the UK, etc. But if you're thinking about it in terms of the actual natural assets themselves, then what it takes to protect and preserve them may have a degree of commonality. Of course, it depends on the condition of them in different locations and the ecosystems in which they're operating. But the notion of what does it take to protect the intrinsic nature of those assets themselves has an element that's quite different from thinking about it in terms of the valuation that we as humans place on them and the different community context in which we determine those valuations. So you can't do these types of exercises on the basis of one form of valuation on their own. And that's the trouble with much of the valuation approach that's emerged to date, that it has basically focused almost exclusively on the valuation of ecosystems without thinking about the costs associated with protecting and preserving and restoring the natural assets themselves.
Fascinating to think about. I think this is a good example of why the difficulty of joining up governance from local to national to global has been so perplexing, because particularly for this issue, there's so much heterogeneity, but also so much potential benefit from working together, cooperating on them. So this was supposed to be a year of big international summits. They're now postponed. Perhaps the silver lining of that postponement is we have a bit more time now to think about getting to some strong outcomes there. I'm curious what the panel thinks. What are the most important things for these two big international events happening now into this changed context of greater urgency? What's the most important thing for COP26 and COP15, Climate COP and the Biodiversity COP to deliver to help advance these kind of nature-based solutions? What would be your wish list? Claire, can we come back to you first to start?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yes, I've been thinking a lot about this recently because of lots of conversations that have gone on. I think three things for me. I think that COP26, COP15 can do. Something that I think Colin has mentioned earlier was around the Dasgupta review, which is kind of exciting. And I think for all of us who've read the interim report, which is a really refreshing change in focus around really being very clear that our economy is embedded within the kind of wider biosphere and natural world. I think I really would like to see COP26, COP15 kind of using and embedding the recommendations that are going to be coming out of that, which we haven't seen yet, but hopefully will be some really nice recommendations around bringing policies together, adopting a kind of nature first position. I think Rosa mentioned that for policy implementation, and really getting to grips with some of the kind of regulation and incentives that we need to kind of help protect our natural world and make sure that yeah, we kind of start to remember that we are within that biosphere. I'd love to see the TNFD as a specific example, the Task Force for a Nature-Related Financial Disclosures initiative kicking off, because I think the TCFD for carbon has been really successful. And I know there seems to be growing momentum now to establish a similar initiative for nature and biodiversity to help, you know, pull the money away from the destructive practices and really pull it towards the kind of nature positive economy that we want to see. I think lastly, I'd love to see, I mean, this webinar is a great example of kind of pulling people together from across the world to share what we're all doing. But I'd love, you know, I really think that COP is such a great platform for doing that. Can we show examples from around the world where people are already living kind of in harmony with nature? That's what we want to see. And how can we, you know, showcase examples of where we can reframe our economy and kind of shift our economies to be more nature-based and, you know, and invest in things that are going to help us be more resilient in our terms of our health, our you know, and our world, in nature-friendly farming, food innovation, ecotourism, and leisure. You know, there's so much that we could be investing in, and I'd love to see COP kind of get some really specific focus on those things. Thank you.
Great. So, goal of putting nature at the center of these different economic processes that are so important, and trying to create some very specific ideas like the nature-based, Nature Task Force Disclosure. Say the acronym, Claire. I can't remember it. Nature.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? The nature-related financial disclosures. Yeah, nature risks for the financial sector, essentially. And the Dutch government have done a brilliant report on that recently called Indebted to Nature, which is worth checking out.
Great. So, really good example of a concrete thing these two big summits might deliver. Rosa, what's on your wish list for the big international events coming up?
Okay, building on what Claire just said on the COPs, taking into consideration the recommendations of other spaces, I would like to argue the things I think that would be very good for everyone coming out of these COPs. Taking into consideration two things. First, that as we know, the results of the COPs in terms of decisions, declarations, or intentions have an impact on decision-making in the countries at different levels, but they have. And maybe not as fast as we would like to see. And the second thing to take into consideration is that decision-making within the formal multilateral processes is not very easy to achieve. Right? We have to consider many aspects for the almost 200 parties to accept a decision. So building on this, I think that given also that the mandates can encourage, can recognize, or can be a little bit more binding, saying that countries shall or should or may, you know, there are different levels of decisions. I would like to see three things. The first one would be a decision that supports or encourages or recognizes the nature-based solutions, quality to boost ambition on the NDCs, at least starting by adaptation. Secondly, a decision that recognizes and links NbS with the role of science. As I said before, now is the moment for science to inform policymakers. People around the world, citizens, policymakers even recognize now the role of science because of the pandemic that we have. And we have to also engage citizens and channel financial instruments, for instance. And thirdly, if this is a call, a decision that comes together of the two conventions, that would be, I think, very important. We have been discussing since Rio more than 2 decades ago, how is it that the two conventions can synergize? Maybe we are in a moment where we can be very clear on this. So this would be my wish list. Thank you.
It's a great wish list. So putting nature-based solutions at the heart of NDCs, linking them to science, and then thinking about synergies across conventions. And actually, I think we might be seeing a little bit of progress on this in the action space that you mentioned at the beginning of the session, where even though the processes are quite entrenched and difficult to change after many years of negotiations, seeing a lot of action happening where different kinds of initiatives and networks are bringing together the climate and biodiversity in a new way. So that's an interesting development. I know that Peru has been a champion of the action space, and so it's interesting to see it replicating here as well. Sabine, what is your wish list for these two processes? You've followed, I know, the climate change negotiations for a great deal of time and have a great deal of experience with it. And actually, if you don't mind me saying, you've, I think, recently expressed publicly some frustration about that process and sort of urged it to deliver. So what is your wish list and how likely are we to get it?
Thank you, Tom. So you're quite right. I have attended every single one of the last 25 conferences of parties of the Climate Convention, and it has been somewhat disappointing over that period of time not to have seen greater action. But I remain an optimist in the face of difficulties. And so I will share my optimism for COP26 in particular. I don't do the CBD, so I'll not comment on COP15, but I will on COP26. Several things there I think are opportunities for us. Firstly, one of the 5 major themes of the COP26 is nature-based solutions under the UK's presidency. And I do know that the UK COP presidency team are taking this quite seriously. So again, an opportunity for us to get it in, and as Rosa says, link it with the Biological Diversity Convention and look for some win-wins in terms of actions, if not in terms of negotiated text. Negotiated text is always extremely difficult to achieve because it has to be approved by consensus by nearly 200 countries and extremely difficult to get anything out of them. On the other hand, actions are possible, and coalitions of the willing to take things forward is, I think, the way for us to go politically and take these political decisions with what I would call coalitions of the willing. We don't need to go for 100% agreement on every little thing, which is the formula that these conferences work under. But that's really not fit for purpose anymore. The urgency means that those who feel things are urgent need to move forward. And if somebody doesn't want to join, and I won't name Mr. T who wants to withdraw, let them. We will carry on. We cannot let one country, one person, or even a small number of countries hold progress up. So that, I think, is a political realization that has come and is something that the rest of the world is now willing to go forward. And the final point I'll make, particularly in the context of linking climate change with biodiversity, is the COVID-19 crisis. The COVID-19 crisis has really raised the issue of the fact that we have failed to preserve our ecosystems, and we are now ruining the results of that. It's a big message. It's cut across everybody. And so in the climate change space, we're now going to have to take that into account. And in particular, as I mentioned earlier, the adaptation space in climate change is very, very amenable to looking at nature-based solutions and adaptation. There's also a concomitant side of the mitigation with, forestry and REDD. But on adaptation, I feel that there is a tremendous opportunity. It's the area I work in. And I'm actually very positive that we may be able to come up with something very concrete. And I emphasize concrete actions versus agreement on text. I don't think that's where the emphasis should be. It should be on something big number of countries coming together to do something. If we can manage that, I would be quite happy with an outcome at COP26 along those lines.
I think that's a very important perspective and likely realistic given where we'll be politically, although who knows, the future, one of the after effects of pushing these conferences back is that there might be some changes in the leadership of certain large countries that, as you mentioned, Celine, may go nameless. So we'll see if that has any effects. Colin, what's your wish list for COP26 and the Biodiversity Cup? And if I might just add to that, one of the issues that's been a bit of a stumbling block in the biodiversity discussions is how we think about having a clear target for the new agreement that gets signed. There's been different formulations, 30 by 30, for example, a list of different outcomes that might be achieved. But unlike in the climate mitigation space, where there's a kind of clear scientific target of reaching a balance between sources and sinks by a certain point in time in order to limit temperature change to a certain degree, that's been harder to think about. And I wonder if you're thinking around how we measure these things might help us see through that stumbling block in some ways.
Yes, indeed. And I think that is a serious difficulty in this area, that in essence, there are many more measures that one needs, metrics, than is the case in relation to CO2 emissions and global warming. There are three things I'd like to emphasize. The first is public sector governance, and really expanding on what I was saying in terms of the public sector governance at a national level, in terms of having an overseeing body like the Natural Capital Committee, a sufficiently long-term plan, a way of identifying the resources that are required to protect and restore natural assets, and therefore the investments that follow from that. That is something that I would like to see promoted at an international level in terms of the adoption of such governance systems across countries, with then an overarching body which would be essentially an international equivalent body that would seek to provide that international coordination in terms of the way in which things are measured in relation in particular to nature-based solutions and natural assets more generally. So first of all, in terms of providing the governance which goes from international to national and from national to local, and at each level having that sort of combination of overseeing governance mechanisms. The second is in terms of the private sector, that we haven't really talked a great deal about the fact that this has to be a coordinated partnership between the private and the public sector. And there have been significant moves by the corporate sector over the last year or so in terms of thinking about objectives that incorporate, in particular, environmental impacts that are gaining a lot of credence. And one of the effects of the current crisis is to really accentuate the importance of having that notion of purposes of business that go beyond just financial objectives. So that is something that I'd like very much to be seen to be promoted in COP26 in particular, as something that should be a major objective, to have a similar sort of governance approach within the private sector. And key to that is the third element that I'd like to emphasize, and that is the importance of bringing the institution, the private institutional investment community on board with doing this. That is the area where a lot of the pressure on companies is coming from, as institutions increasingly recognize this as being a growing systemic risk that they face that has serious consequences for the risks of the assets that they're investing in and increasing stranded assets that they face. So it needs to have private sector investment alongside public sector investment, and that then needs the combination not just of a reform of public governance of this, but also of private governance alongside it.
So a really interesting way to note that we need actually not just a public sector reform, we don't just need to get our governance institutions right, but the governments, but actually to mainstream that through all aspects of business. and probably of other parts of the world as well, other sectors of society. So that's a very big challenge. We described at the beginning of the panel this as a super year, and now all the more critical. We've identified some very promising examples, success stories, achievements, innovations. But I think there's probably a lot of people in the audience who are thinking, or feeling at least, there's a large gap between where we are now, where the world seems to be not moving down the pathway of solutions, at least not at the scale and speed that we need to. So you mentioned the scale, the urgency of getting to beyond the sort of traditional slow incremental conservationist approach, something that's much faster and much larger. We all seem to agree that that's where we need to get to. But I think I'm also feeling a little bit daunted by the scale of that challenge and how we make practical progress on it. So I wonder if we might just bring our conversation to a close by asking each of you to offer some ideas on what can we do next? What is the next step for this very, very big transition? Colin just recommended reshaping not just all of government, but also all of business in the private sector and how the economy functions. What can we do practically to move forward from here? Claire, can I put that very difficult question to you first?
I think we need to get our incentives and finance sorted out, and I'll come back again to that point around the task, getting the finance sector to stop being blind to the nature destruction that is being caused around the world. So to make that visible and to really require the finance sector to stop investing in nature destruction. And I think on a domestic level, we need to probably get our regulations and our incentives, our taxes and our subsidies, aligned again to more nature positive outcomes. So, I mentioned the new agricultural subsidies that will be coming in the agriculture bill, ELMS. We're trying to shift the balance, and I think getting the kind of fiscal measures and the kind of financial measures moving will help with a lot of that stuff. But we need multi-sector kind of collaborations as well, because nature-based solutions are, as we know, all cross-cutting. But I think if we can get the financing sorted so that the private and the public can joint finance things and blend funding, because the private sector has an incentive to, then that will definitely make a big dent in where we need to go, get us a good step forward.
Great, so get the money flowing in the right direction and begin to go in place much more easily. A very practical, maybe useful suggestion. Rosa, what next steps do you see on this agenda?
Well, I would like to build on Claire's intervention and also on some of the questions posted to us. I would say that two elements are very important, at least from the point of view of a developing country as Peru. The first one is the evidence that we need, and here we come also to the measurement issue that Colin brought. The measurement of the evidence that NbS, nature-based solutions, can bring to solve some societal challenges. And the second one has to do also with the consciousness that Claire mentioned. We need kind of from the side of the demand, this demand for more nature-based solutions, policies and actions. We have different kinds of social groups in our societies, and each of them have different needs. But I think that we can say that almost everyone in the planet needs nature to keep on living, but that is not very well recognized, and we need this awareness to be involved. Thank you.
Great, so evidence, plan, and action, I think, is a very concrete agenda for us all. Thanks for putting it so clearly. Salim, your thought on next steps.
Sure. So let me start by describing what I do. My day job is working on adaptation to climate change in the most vulnerable communities in some of the most vulnerable countries like Bangladesh, but also in other least developed countries. And I am a great fan of the 16-year-old Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, who has managed to get school kids in every single country around the world organized and following a global platform. And they have this Fridays Future group that has been demonstrating every Friday. And then once we had the COVID pandemic, they've gone online and they are still continuing. I was invited to speak to them a few weeks ago. And I'm very impressed by the way that they have linked up school kids all over the world, including many in Bangladesh. And so I believe that what we need to be looking at is a parallel, similar linking of local communities working on nature-based solutions. As I said, there are many of them in the forestry sector, in the wetland sector, in different sectors, indigenous peoples, many people all over the world. They're scattered. They're not really connected, although there have been various attempts to do that. To me, that is the way forward. If we can get better global solidarity amongst the different groups that are actually practicing nature-based solutions around the world, and get them to be a force to be reckoned with at the national and global level, which we, again, unfortunately haven't been able to do, that would be where I think they might be worth putting a great deal more thinking, effort, and given the opportunities by this new online world, see whether we can connect better going forward.
Great, so build a movement is the next step.
Exactly.
Salim, I look forward to seeing your hashtag Fridays for Nature taking over the internet soon. Colin, your thoughts on next steps, please.
Well, it was Milton Friedman who said that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that change occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So therefore our duty, he said, to deliver alternatives to existing policies, keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. That's exactly what's happening at the moment. Okay, we're going through a crisis in which there is a fundamental rethink going on about the way in which we live our lives and the actions that we want different parties and the public and the private sector to be taking in response to that. And that is exactly what it provides us with an opportunity to address issues around nature-based solutions. Because what we really need to do at this point is to come up with ideas as to how nature-based solutions can be effectively implemented, how they really are cost-effective in terms of addressing solutions, and why now, okay, why it's absolutely critical that we take those actions and recognize that their implementation can and should be done today. And I think that given what is currently in progress, the question is not whether these things are going to happen, but how many crises will it take till we actually get round to doing this really effectively. And my hope is it won't take too many more.
I hope that's absolutely right, Colin. I think any panel that ends with both Greta Thunberg and Milton Friedman is one that's covered a lot of ground and a lot of intellectual breadth. So I really appreciate all of the fantastic comments people have offered. Before we thank the panelists, let me just remind you that we'll be starting again in about 10 minutes with the final session of posters and then an exciting closing keynote from Christiana Figueres. So please do stick around for that. But before we break for tea or something else, please just join me in thanking our fantastic panelists who have talked about the innovations we're seeing in national governance of nature-based solutions and thinking about how these big events coming up next year can scale up, multiply, and quickly and radically and at scale advance that problem going forward. Thank you all for your time. I look forward to continuing the conversation shortly.